And it is my pleasure now to introduce David Peterson. David has a degree in history from Oxford University, where he was Susan Reynolds' last student at Lady Margaret Hall, and a PhD in medieval history from the Universidad de Burgos in 2006. His research centers on early medieval society in northern Iberia and is based mainly on writer sources and onomastics. He's the author of 3 monographs on the early medieval period in, respectively, the Sierra de la Demanda, the Alto Ebro, and the Rioja. Well, based at the Universidad del País Vasco, he was responsible for the development of the digital edition of the Becerro Gallicano, the San Millán de la Cogolla, and more recently has edited Cartulario de Froncea, and has worked on the cartularies of Santo Domingo de la Calzada. Since 2015, he has taught medieval history at the Universidad de Burgos, and today David will be presenting The Blood of the Amazighs, Anomalous Distribution of North African Genetic Characteristics in Northwestern Iberia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, I wrote that bio myself. It's interesting that I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. We just saw a really good paper from Ned about how interdisciplinary teams should work, and now we're going to see a good example of when it goes wrong. Okay. But first of all, I want to thank the organisers, particularly Tom and T as well, and the UCLA for making all this possible and their generosity, and everybody here for wonderful papers yesterday, and for really friendly atmosphere. So I'm really enjoying myself. So thank you very much. Okay, so if I can work out how this works. I'll open my paper if I can find it. I'm going to share it. I'm going to do an F5, do I? Yes. Okay. Northwestern Iberia in the 8th century is a bit of a conundrum. What exactly happened in the far northwest of the peninsula in the decades following the Islamic invasion of 711 has long intrigued historians, and yet it is tantalizingly out of reach. Our narrative sources are few and far between, well, few and problematical. There is no archaeological record, or barely any. And for charter evidence, we must wait another century. Nonetheless, in general terms, it is agreed that it was initially, at least, nominally subjugated by the Muslim army, a process detailed in this map we see here, taken from the excellent Al-Andalus y la Historia blog. A note here that places such as Astorga and Lugo, in the northwest, are on this itinerary of conquest, as detailed originally by Juan Fafaya. A geography today broadly accepted, I think it's fair to say. But what differentiates this region, the northwest, from the other parts of Iberia, is that it fell out of Andalusi control after about 750. Thus, it was a part of Iberia under Muslim rule for the shortest period. The question is what legacy, if any, this relatively brief 40-year interval had on Northwestern Iberian society. So people have long speculated about this. Here is Richard Ford back in 1832 on the Maragato ethnicity from the area around the city of Astorga. And here we see a Maragato man as depicted by Gustave Doré. Richard Ford here note suggestions that alongside other theories, that they might have North African origins, yes, and indeed different anthropologists since then have noted similarities in dress, hairstyles, marital rituals, etc., between the Maragatos and certain Amazigh groups. Oliver Racine, furthermore argued that the Maragato name itself derived from that of the Amazigh Baragatwa tribe. Although it's impossible to prove this, of course. And in this context, the possibility of studying historical population movements from genetic sampling of modern inhabitants is very suggestive. And in this paper, we will observe how, in recent decades, a number of such studies, 7 in total, spanning 20 years, have directly addressed the question of North African genetic traces in Iberia, consistently reporting the highest concentrations in the Northwest. And indeed, the first such study that we will contemplate focused specifically on the Maragatos by Larua. These are the 7 studies that we will handle. I will refer to them all henceforth simply by the lead authors, but all of them are in fact et ali, and in some cases very much so, with as many as 70 co-authors in one case. Some of these co-authors are repeated across the studies, indicating a degree of continuity, and in fact on some occasions they even share data. I expect that this interdependency leads to some problems when it comes to interpreting the results. Nonetheless, there are also significant differences in terms of methodology. If initially the focus was on mitochondrial DNA, exclusively female transmission, with particular attention paid to the U6 haplogroup, but more recently, male lineages traced via the Y chromosome have also been analysed. The case with the Adams and Regato studies, for example. Moreover, over time, techniques have improved and more precise chronologies have started to emerge. There are, of course, also differences in spatial reference, as you can see from the titles, and thus the data sets. From the Maragatos at one extreme to the whole of Southern Europe or the Western Mediterranean. Although typically the Iberian Peninsula is the frame of reference, and within it, time and again, the Northwest stands out. The results emerging with remarkable consistency from different research groups employing a variety of methodologies are extremely interesting. Both female and male lineages report remarkably high concentrations of North African genetic traces in Northwestern Iberia. They are consistently the highest concentrations in the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. And when the studies are more broad-reaching, they're also the highest in the whole of continental Europe. And I should add here that the 3 studies not included on this slide, so as to not overload it, report similar findings. Leaning more on the similarities between these studies than on the differences I mentioned, I will henceforth treat them as a coherent corpus in terms of results. I recognise that there is a certain methodological risk to this. It's possible, for example, that the Maragato stratum is distinct from the Northern Portuguese one in terms of origin and chronology. Although the coincidence in results between the 2 areas, the 2 studies at the top of this slide, is striking. Nonetheless, I believe that this is the only sensible way to advance if we're to make sense of this conundrum, because a conundrum it really does seem to be, and it's really well expressed here by Bycroft, who for me summarized it perfectly. Surprisingly, North African ancestry does not reflect proximity to North Africa, or even regions under more extended Muslim control. That qualifier under Muslim control is significant here. For, as we have already pointed out, after approximately 750, the Northwest fell out of Andalusí political control. But it is dangerous to conflate geopolitical control with demographic legacy, an error which I believe has led to some confusion. All the geneticists are naturally aware of the 8th century Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, and a priori this would seem the most economical hypothesis to explain the observed genetic legacy. And indeed, since almost all of the studies engage with this theme, this seems to be the initial thinking of the authors. However, if a distribution is in itself a surprise, this is compounded by the generalized belief among the authors of these studies, based on supposedly historiographical grounds, but the invasion had little or no impact on the Northwest. And here we see, for example, Pereira saying that Northern Iberia was never under permanent Islamic administration, or Adams saying that Galicia, alongside other northern regions, remained largely unoccupied, or Bycroft understanding that the region of Galicia, as it is defined today, was never under Muslim rule. Such statements, repeated across the different studies, are surprising, given that neither the primary sources nor the cited historiography actually supports such views, as we will see, and as the map that we opened with also indicates. This dissonance is important as it's what transforms an interesting distribution into a paradoxical one, and that's where the problems start as the geneticists attempt to make their results conform with an erroneous understanding of Iberian history. So I just sort of attempt to demonstrate that statement, that their understanding is erroneous. Here referring to some of the primary sources, well, virtually all the primary sources we have for this period. Yeah, we have one of the earliest narrative accounts of the invasion, accompanied by references to events in the mid-8th century, which resulted in the said loss of Andalusí control over the Northwest. If in such sources the geography tends to be generic, and as Bycroft alludes to, it's correct to be wary of the meaning Galicia in this period. Nonetheless, Astorga, the home of the Maragatos, is repeatedly referenced, while the sources also indicate Muslim control of areas and centres further to the north and west, Lugo, Tui, Porto, Braga, Chaves, or more generically, beyond the mountain passes from Astorga. In other words, the few narrative sources that we do have from both Arab and Christian traditions coincide in that the Northwest was conquered, at least as far as Astorga and Lugo anyway, which grosso modo coincides with the areas giving us these anomalous genetic results. For if we map in white these textual references to the conquest and subsequent Amazigh revolt, against in red the areas detected in the genetic studies as having the highest concentrations of North African ancestry, we know there's a strong spatial correlation. Logically, the specialist historiography reflects what the primary sources tell us. In all of these books, the historians agree with the fire that the Northwest was initially subjugated and that effective Muslim control over the region lasted until the mid-8th century. For example, Shane, cited by Laruga, in each case, in brackets, is the name of a geneticist who authors the article citing the historian. Yeah? So Shane, cited by Laruga, specifically refers to the taking of Leon and Galicia. Serrao and Marquez, used by Pereira, accept the conquest of the whole of Portugal and mention Amazigh rebellion in Galicia in 740. Collins, the go-to author for Adams, contemplates a complete initial occupation also. Barbero and Vigil, used indirectly by Bycroft, mention Lugo and Astorga as having been subjugated, while Simon Barton, referenced also by Bycroft, accepted the Muslim conquest of the Northwest and the presence therein of Amazigh garrisons as late as the 740s. So broadly a consensus here, and yet, remarkably, these are the very works that the geneticists cite to support their rejection of the 8th century, because the Northwest was, scare quotes, never under Muslim rule. In other words, we have a bit of a problem. The historiography doesn't actually say what the geneticists think it does. And let's look at one specific case to demonstrate how this works. That of the most recent article by Bycroft from 2019. I apologize in advance for somewhat dense historiographical tangent here, but this is significant as being where the geneticists' good intentions vis-a-vis interdisciplinarity run into trouble, which means that ultimately this fascinating distribution hasn't had the impact among medievalists that I think it deserves. Bycroft quotes Pallares and Portela, who in turn refer to recent work by Bera and Vigil. Recent is their term. Okay, so the book in question is Barbero and Vigil's famous La formación del feudalismo en la península ibérica, which proffered some of the most thought-provoking and controversial ideas on early medieval Iberia. La Formación is not a monograph on the invasion, as, for example, Chalmeta or Collins could be regarded. And moreover, many of Barbero and Mejil's theories, specifically the one referred to by Pallares on the existence of a Visigothic limes, are today generally rejected. Nonetheless, even accepting Barbero and Mejil as authorities, they don't say that all of modern Galicia went unconquered, but instead they accept the conquest of southwestern Galicia as far as the Minho River and Lugo, which is where they actually situated their limes. And because the river Minho does not, as Bycroft erroneously states, mark the limit of modern Galicia, except for in its southwestern extreme on the modern Portuguese border. In fact, the Minho bisects Galicia, as you can see in our map. So what we are seeing here is a failure of interdisciplinarity. Without any historians on board their teams, the use of historiography by these teams is, sorry to say it, but it's simplistic and it's confused. Bycroft's team use a 1998 divulgative general history of Galicia, which recycles a debunked theory from the 1970s, which doesn't say what they think it does. This makes the dismissal, or best marginalization, of the 8th century profoundly flawed. And yet, the genuinely held belief that Galicia was never under permanent Islamic administration, according to Pereira, or remained largely unoccupied, Adams, or was never under Muslim rule, Bycroft, that belief is embedded into the geneticists' interpretation of their own results. And this misreading of medieval history is what leads to the rejection of the 8th century time and again across the studies, and thus obliges them to look elsewhere for explanations. A reasonable question to ask at this point, then, is whether there are actually genetics arguments against the 8th century as an explanation. Arguments that might have contributed to this generalized rejection of an early medieval chronology. The key concept here is that of divergence. If all North African genetic traits observed were identical, the implication would be for a very recent origin. If, on the other hand, there is significant divergence, the implication would be for a more remote source. In the earlier study, La Ruga, the degree of divergence observed was regarded as favouring a prehistoric origin. However, this study has since proved to be an outlier, and all subsequent authors observe relatively low diversity, and thus argue for an origin in what they term generally as the historical period, or more vaguely as undefined recency. Some studies, however, offer more concrete chronologies. Particularly frustrating in this sense. I find it odd, I end up talking about frustration and disappointment here, but it's a bit odd for historians to talk in those terms. Maybe I'm getting too involved, but anyway, particularly frustrating is the sense, in this sense, is Pereira, who actually identifies the Islamic period as the origin for these North African lineages, at least initially, and states that the most probable historical event is obviously the Islamic invasion. However, they then row back from there because they argue that Northern Iberia was never under permanent Islamic administration, citing Serrano and Marquez, who we recall don't say anything of the sort. Okay. Bycroft's, as the most recent study, down at the bottom here, is the most precise in chronological terms, and initially states our results indicate that it is possible to discern clear genetic impacts of the Muslim conquest, with North African ancestry highest in Galicia. And yet, frustratingly again, the historiographically driven perception that the region was never significantly under Muslim rule leads all these authors, well, leads Bycroft in this case, to eschew the early medieval period as an explanation, and opts instead for entirely undocumented later internal migratory flows or large-scale expulsion of Muslim people, which occurred post-conquest. I put Bycroft at the bottom of this slide, which progresses in chronological order. So this is particularly disappointing, given that their enhanced chronological fine-tuning in this more recent study point specifically towards the early medieval origin. But they're far from alone in this. Because the 8th century is perceived as being impossible, the pursuit of historically tenuous alternatives is widespread. So we've seen how Laruga argued for a hypothetical prehistoric origin, which he doesn't go on to define. Regueiro opts for supposedly well-documented his Phoenician and Roman commerce, which of course is well-documented, but there's very little evidence, certainly of the Phoenicians establishing colonies in the Iberian interior, other than perhaps at Rio Tinto. In both cases, both Phoenician and Roman, the Medulus gold mines in Western Leon might explain the presence of enslaved population in the interior, but it's certainly not well documented that these people were from North Africa. Plaza suggests post-15th century contact between Europeans and Canary Aborigines to explain the distribution. But the most frustrating tendency of all is the emphasis on 16th century Morisco expulsions referred to by Bycroft and also by Adams and Regueiro. Okay? This seems to be emerging as the preferred explanation, and yet these expulsions are extremely well documented and have absolutely no relevance to the far northwest, as both this map from the University of Sevilla's Encrucijada project shows, and similarly the bureaucratically precise figures for the relatively few Moriscos who reached Castile, as quoted by Harvey. Another author that the geneticists cite in supporting their explanation, when, as you can see, he does not have no such thing. So, conclusions. The fundamental problem to me seems to be a breakdown in interdisciplinarity. I should say so, I'm no sense suggesting any bad faith on the part of the geneticists, but rather a systematic failure of the genetics teams to understand the historiography. No doubt mapped by my own inevitably simplistic understanding of their studies. And I believe that historians and Arabists, and I'm conscious that's a bit asymmetrical, that's binary. Historians and Arabists need to engage some more and move beyond their comfort zones. Something impeded, certainly in Spain at least, by the ever-increasing specialization of the university system and research projects. We should be doing what Ned's doing, but it really doesn't seem to work very well in Spain. Furthermore, while Arabists are perhaps understandably not particularly motivated by the meager pickings available to them in the Northwest, many medievalists shy away from a methodologically impenetrable hiatus that serves as a distraction from the application of more general historiographical models to understand the post-Roman world in the Iberia Peninsula, which is where the direction that all the sort of the cool kids are moving in. This paper has, I fear, become a bit bogged down as I attempt to unravel where this misunderstanding has come from and hence why these studies are not being assimilated into medievalists' discourses. I think this is a mistake, and I prefer to finish on a more positive note and insist on a set of remarkably consistent and challenging results, which is a real message here. If they are perceived as anomalies, it is precisely because they force us to question assumptions about the demographic impacts that the Muslim invasion had on the Northwest, the Iberian center of the Amazigh rebellion of the 740s. If we return to our opening riddle, these results potentially shine some light on the 8th century Northwest, and as such deserve to be better known, which I hope that future studies, with ever-improving techniques, find themselves unshackled from unhelpful historiographical models. Thank you very much.